Good evening. This is Billy Munsing. I'm going to talk to you tonight about communication apprehension. Communication apprehension is a person's level of fear or anxiety associated with either real or anticipated communication. I chose this topic because it relates to a lot of other things we discussed in this class, such as self-perceived communication competence and willingness to communicate. In fact, both of these relate directly to communication apprehension. While they relate positively with each other, they have a negative correlation to communication apprehension. For example, if you have a high level of willingness to communicate, you're going to have a lower level of communication apprehension. And if you have a lower level of self-perceived communication competence, you're going to have a higher level of communication apprehension. Communication apprehension is very common. My research showed that 31% of elementary-aged kids have some level of communication apprehension, and public speaking always comes up when people are asked about their fears. This is odd to me because until I studied communication, I'd never heard the term communication apprehension before, and I think a lot of people attribute the symptoms of communication apprehension with shyness, with quietness, or other general anxiety disorders. It's important to remember that things like shyness and quietness are conscious behavioral decisions and don't necessarily reflect a person's opinion or feelings on communication. Communication apprehension is very variable. Your level of communication apprehension changes based on the situation that you're in. For example, I have low levels of communication apprehension when I'm speaking with family or friends, but a high level of communication apprehension when I'm talking to a large group. For a lot of people, the opposite is true. My research showed that 10% of people who consider themselves communication apprehensive are so in one-on-one conversations. A key word in communication apprehension is self-perceived. It's important to remember that communication apprehension is a person's feelings on communication and not necessarily anything to do with their communication skills. People with communication apprehension can have great success in communicating in those situations where they have lower levels of communication apprehension. Communication apprehension affects the body. I've created a visual aid showing these effects. When a person with communication apprehension communicates, their cheeks may flush, their heart is racing, palms are sweaty, and they're feeling nauseous. They often also go into the fight or flight response. They'll either leave the situation immediately, that's the flight, or they'll overcompensate by overcommunicating, that's the fight. This overcommunication is obviously often not very meaningful, necessary, or successful communication. In my research, it was interesting to see the other places where communication apprehension pops up. I had only ever considered it in the educational realm, but it really does affect every aspect of people's lives. People with high levels of communication apprehension are at a disadvantage professionally because they're likely to receive fewer job offers, hold lower ranked positions, earn less income, and avoid certain communication channels that could help them professionally. This is because they're perceived as less informative, less effective, less productive, and less likely to excel than their coworkers with lower levels of communication apprehension. One study I looked at communication apprehension in patients at a doctor's office. Patients with communication apprehension often don't share details of their medical history or current symptoms with their doctors. And this clinic was looking for a way to combat that. And what they've done pretty successfully is given out information about the doctors to prospective patients before they show up so that they can kind of get to know them and feel more comfortable with them because they don't feel like they're talking to a complete stranger. This creates immediacy between the patient and the doctor. I also chose this topic because my background is in education, and I think it's important for educators not only to have the basic understanding of communication apprehension, but know how to recognize it in their students and know ways that they can help those students with communication apprehension feel more comfortable in their classroom. The first way I'm going to talk about that teachers can do this is not to grade on participation. I want everyone to promise that if they're ever in a teaching or grading situation, that they won't grade on participation. This doesn't add anything to the class discussion. All it does is force the students to come up with things to say rather than letting the conversation flow naturally. There will be enough students in your classrooms that want to communicate, that have things to say, that there's no need to force your students to come up with something to say. I had a lot of instances in this in my undergraduate career. I had one professor who 30% of our grade was based on class participation. And at the end of the semester, I was informed that I had received a low mark in this aspect of the rubric, and that I didn't communicate in the classroom, didn't drive the discussion. I only communicated when it was necessary. And this affected my grade. A lot of other teachers also used class participation as kind of extra credit that students could earn. And from a communication apprehension standpoint, I think this is a much, much better way to go. The second way I'm going to talk about is giving students options whenever possible. This way they can kind of tailor the activity toward their personal learning style, and those students with communication apprehension can avoid those activities that require communication. You can also do this if you have assigned a presentation, and you can allow a student with communication apprehension to work with another student. They can work together in coming up with what to say, designing the PowerPoint and handouts, but when it comes to the actual participation or presentation, the student with communication apprehension can kind of sit back, run the PowerPoint, pass out the handouts, where the other student can do the actual talking. So this communication apprehensive student still gets, the academic side of the activity, just not the forced pressure of communication. Another example is you can allow students to answer questions through writing and anonymously turn them in to be answered. This takes the pressure off the students, and you'll get better results. A third way I'm going to talk about is to make sure your responses to student communication is consistent. To a student with communication apprehension, it's really important that they almost know how you're going to respond before they talk. If they see your responses to other students as positive, they're not going to fear that your response to them will be negative. A fourth way you can reduce the communication apprehension in your classroom is to not call on random students. In my undergraduate career, we talked about this a lot, but recently with my research, I've come to find that it really doesn't have a whole lot of educational use. Those students with communication apprehension are just going to be sitting there, waiting their turn, worrying about what they're going to say, and not listening to anything else that's being said. They're not going to retain any of that information. I'm going to close with a quote from Jerry Seinfeld that relates to communication apprehension. In his stand-up, he said that to the average person at a funeral, they would rather be in the casket than giving the eulogy. This may seem a little crass, but I think it's also very true. Thank you for your attention.